Hello world, and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, architect at Winelec, and today we're going to be looking at an introduction to Azure Policy. Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about Azure Policy. We're going to be doing a multi-part series on this because this is a fairly broad topic and there's a lot that we can talk about with it. So today we're just going to introduce the idea of what policy can do, and then we're going to do a quick demo in the portal of how you can spin up some of the default policies and then use those right away inside of your Azure subscriptions or resource groups, whatever those might be. So in Azure, you can basically use policy for doing two kinds of broad actions. You can use it for auditing, and you can also use it for enforcement. So when we talk about auditing, we're talking about the ability to check Azure resources against specific kinds of rules that we want to have in play in our Azure environment. So if I want to define a policy that says I want firewalls to have specific settings on them, then I can set up a policy to define firewalls with a given set of ports that need to be open or closed. And then I can take that same policy, apply it to a resource group or subscription, and then see which resources are out of bounds based on that policy's definition. And then if I want to, I can automate remediation efforts based on that. But generally speaking, the audit idea is so that I can see what is in compliance and what is out of compliance with my policy settings that I have turned on. Now with enforcement, I can enforce those same kind of rules for policies that are created, and then I can then apply those to resources on Azure to make sure that certain things don't happen, or if certain things do happen depending on what I'm trying to do. So for instance, if I wanted to enforce a specific kind of VM on Azure, I can go into Azure Policy, specify a rule that only these VM SKUs are allowed, and then I can then apply that to a resource group and only allow specific VM sizes in a given resource group to be created, and anything outside of that would be denied. Another thing I can do with policy would be to create a set of predefined tags that I want to show up on all of my resources so that I can ensure that all of my resources have specific tags on them with specific values so that I can control things like billing, or I can use those tags actually for defining other policies that are conditional based on a given environment. So these are some of the kinds of things that you can do with tagging, but the bottom line is that we can use them to evaluate our environment with an audit, or we can use it to control our environment with an enforcement of policy whenever we deploy those. So let's talk about the taxonomy of Azure Policy as well. So when we talk about Azure Policy, we have the most basic unit, which is a policy. And we're going to get more into the details of what makes up a policy when we talk about building custom policies in a future video. But for now, let's just talk about it as a policy in general. I have a single policy that I can use. Now, that's the most basic unit in Azure Policy, but sometimes I can create multiple policies. So maybe I have 6, 10, 100 different policies that I want to create. And if I wanted to manage all of those as a set, I can create multiple policies and create what is called an initiative inside of Azure Policy. So this allows me to group multiple policies together. So an initiative is a group of policies, or I can just assign single policies as I so choose, depending on what level of detail I need for whatever I'm trying to do with Azure Policy. So next thing that I can look at is the scope of which I'm going to apply a policy at. So the scope is important because the scope will determine how broad a policy is applied. So the broadest level which I can apply a policy to would be a management group. So this scope would basically mean I can apply a policy to a set of subscriptions. So that's what a management group is. And this is really utilized by enterprises that have EA agreements typically, and they want to manage a whole set of subscriptions inside of a single group. And that's what a management group is. It allows me to take a policy and I can apply a policy to a set of subscriptions within a management group. I can also use RBAC in this context as well, but in the terms of Azure Policy, that is the most broad category where I can apply a policy to. And then within a management group, of course, I have multiple subscriptions. I need one or more subscriptions inside that management group. And then I can apply the actual policy or the initiative onto a single subscription, or I can apply it to a group of subscriptions with a management group. And then within a subscription, I can also apply policies down at the resource group level if I so choose. So if I want to assign an initiative to a resource group or a single policy to a resource group, I can do that as well. So whether I'm applying a policy or initiative, I can apply both at the management group, at the subscription level, or at the resource group level, depending on how granular I want a given set of rules defined by my policies to apply. So Azure Policy comes with a number of pre-built compliance checking policies that you can adopt that can check your environment against open standards that already exist. And so these policies are pre-built so that you don't have to build them yourselves. So if you adopt these, you can check to see whether or not your environment is in compliance with one of these open standards that exist. I'm going to name a couple common ones here, but there are multiple ones that exist out there that you can apply to Azure. So one of the common ones is the Azure Security Benchmark. Now this is a security standard that is defined by Microsoft according to the well-architected framework that you can adopt to check your environment against best practices, or at least what Microsoft considers to be best practices on Azure for security purposes using the Azure Security Benchmark. So this is a good baseline for just some basic security checks in your environment. Now, the CIS Microsoft Azure Foundation benchmark is a good standard that is not a Microsoft defined standard. Rather, it is a third party, that is the CIS Foundation, that is designed for checking against best practices and policies that they define that can be applied to multiple clouds, but this is implemented for Microsoft Azure. So you can use this set of policies to check against the CIS or CIS Foundation's best practices for cybersecurity in the cloud as well. A third one would be HIPAA HITRUST, and this is a very common one for folks that fall under HIPAA regulations and have to be compliant to these standards. And this is one of those things that something like healthcare would have to comply with because they are dealing with HIPAA data that would be underneath this particular standard here. So implementing the policy here will help ensure that your environment is compliant with HIPAA HITRUST. And then, of course, you have the National Institute for Security Standards right here. And these are policies that NIST defines for cloud security as well. And if you want to adopt one of these and you have to be compliant with one of these, you can adopt one of these set of policies and you can apply these to your environment for NIST compliance as well. So again, here's just 5 common ones. There are other ones out there that you can apply to your environment. And depending on the compliance that you do need, it's almost always best to at least adopt one of these, particularly Azure Security Benchmark or CIS, and use one of those for baseline securities and best practices on Azure for security purposes. But if you are a regulated industry, of course, you can adopt one of these last 3 that are mentioned here as well. Okay, I'm here in the Azure portal. So for the demo for this, I want to create a policy that only allows specific VMs to be created in this resource group of given SKUs. So to do that, I'm going to create a policy to do that. So I've already created the resource group, but to create the policy, I need to go to the Azure service called policy. If it doesn't show up here inside of this bar right here, you can go to more services over here and find it, or you can just simply type in policy up here in the search bar and look for policy that way. Now, this is the dashboard for Azure Policy, and you can see here that I have a number of policies already applied to subscriptions, and these are Azure Security Center default policies that have already been created against my subscriptions here, and it's showing me that I have a bunch of junk out of compliance. This is just a bunch of subscriptions that are for dev, and so I'm not real concerned about these, but if this was a prod environment, I'd want to walk through this to figure out why my resources aren't compliant, and then go ahead and enforce or alter or remediate whatever I might need to get these back into compliance with what Azure Security Center is telling me is a good best practice on Azure for security. Now, next thing I need to do to create a policy, though, is go over here to definitions. Now, under definitions, I have a bunch of given types of definitions I can apply. Now, if I wanted to apply one of these given definitions here that already exist, I can do that. Remember, I mentioned a bunch of them in the slide. Here's one of them, that SIS Microsoft Azure Foundation benchmark that has 87 policies as a part of it. That would be for compliance checking against this standard. But notice I have PCI compliance if I want to apply that. I have one from Canada Federal PBMM. I'm not sure what that is. I don't work in Canada, but if I needed to build something that was compliant in Canada, maybe I should apply this policy here. Or if I wanted to create one for something that was HIPAA or HITRUST, I can apply that there. So there's a number of pre-built policies that you can apply to your Azure resources that are available right here inside of the definitions. Now, if I don't care about these initiatives that have a bunch of pre-built policies, I can just choose of all types, all categories. If I want to look for compute, I can select all and then select compute. And then I can come over here to definitions and click on policy, and I can see a bunch of policies that apply to compute. Now, the one I'm interested in is allow virtual machine size SKUs. So this one is the one I'm going to be interested in for creating a set of virtual machines inside of a resource group that are only within a predefined set of SKUs for whatever I want to apply here for this policy. So because this is a pre-built policy, I don't have to build it. But to use this, I'm just simply going to click it. And this is the code for that. So if I wanted to copy and paste this and modify this policy, I could easily do that and import it as a custom policy. But I'm not going to do that today. We're going to get into that in a future video. But for today, I just want to create this policy using this pre-built-in policy. So with that, I'm just going to leave it as is, and I'm going to click on assign. So I've chosen the policy. Now I'm choosing the scope of this particular policy. How broadly or how narrowly do I want this policy to apply? So the scope of this, I'm basically going to use it for that resource group. So I'm going to choose the subscription it's in, and there's the resource group. So that's the scope of the policy that I want to apply this to. And I can give it a name, allow VM SKUs for size B series SKUs. And that's what I'm going to use for this particular assignment. I'm going to give it the same description is here. Now, policy enforcement is if I want to enforce this policy, I would enforce it right here. If I disable that, that's going to be, I can use it for auditing. So that's how I can apply it to audit a given environment. I'm not enforcing it. I'm just checking for compliance here. So I want to enforce this though, so it will not allow me to create a VM unless it's within a given set of SKUs. So I'm going to turn that on. And let's go ahead and choose the SKUs here. So this is going to allow me to create a bunch of SKUs that I can choose from. So I'm going to choose all the standard B series SKUs right here. And that will give me a set of B series VMs for creation. And if I scroll down, I have a bunch of other ones I could choose from, but I'm mostly interested in B series because that's what this policy is for. So I've got 10 different SKUs for that. And I can set up remediations if I so choose for this, and this would be for managed identities. If I want to automate remediations for this, I can do that, but I'm going to skip this step, and I'm going to come over here to review and create, and then create this policy. Now, this one creates really quickly, and it's applied very quickly. So let's go back over here to policy and look at my assignments here. So now I should see a set of policies, and this is the one that I just created right here. And it's allow virtual machine B series SKUs on this particular scope right here. It's in a particular resource group. It's a single policy, not an initiative. And I have a single policy in it rather than an initiative with 140 policies at a subscription level. This is a single policy at a resource group level. So now that I have that, let's go in and try and create a virtual machine that is something outside of the B series that I have chosen for this particular policy. Okay, now that I have the policy created, I'm going to come back over here to all services, and I'm going to click on the Microsoft Azure to come back to the dashboard for my login here. And I'm going to go into this resource group that I've applied this policy to. So for this, I can click on policies, and this should show me what has been applied to this. So this is basically showing me allow for B series VMs, and it says not started because of the compliance state. I don't really have anything that's enforcing at this point. So let's go ahead and create this particular policy that I want to do right here. And it's already applied the Azure Security Center defaults because there's no resources here. I don't have anything to worry about. But let's go ahead and try and create a VM in this policy resource group that I have here. So I'm going to click on add. I'm going to click on Ubuntu server, and I'm just going to create a VM, call it DS1 VM. And I can select the region. I'm just going to basically take all the defaults on this, except make sure that I don't have anything that is in that set of SKUs that I checked. So a DS1 would be outside of that. So let's just use this. I'm going to use a password here. Let's see, use public keys pair password. This one I use, and I'm just going to create a user here, Blaze, and create a password for that. And it wants me to have a better password than that. And I'm just making one up right here. Yep, and that will suffice. And I basically can take most of the defaults in this. I don't need a public inbound port for this. I don't really need, I can create a network security group or any of that. I don't need any of the management turned off. I'm just going to disable this, turn off all this stuff, and then come over here to tags and create and review. And I'm going to try to create this VM with that policy in play, but it is outside of the virtual, the SKU is outside the virtual machine set that I allow for. So when I create this, it should fail. So let's wait for that to happen. So here is my failed deployment. Now this is a deployment where I had a couple of things that were created. The NIC was created, the actual virtual networks were created, the IPs were created, the NSGs were created. All of these things were created because these didn't have any policies. This one did. So if I come over here and look at the actual problem here, you can see here the resource is disallowed by policy identifier. If I look at the error, it'll show me at least one resource failed for whatever reason. Resource DS1 VM, it was disallowed by policy identifier, allow B series virtual machine B series SKUs only. So this failed because of the policy I had in play. But let's go try it and create a new resource within the policy and then watch it create, because it will pass compliance enforced by policy. So I've cleaned up the resource group from all the resources that did get successfully created in my last attempt. This time I'm going to create a B series VM, and this one I'm going to call it B1 VM, and let's choose a SKU that is within the range of allowed SKUs that I want. So any of the standard B2S or one of the other standard B series VMs should be fine for this particular policy that I have in play here. So let's create a user and give it a good password here, and use that. And I'm just going to go take some of the defaults in this. I don't want an inbound public IP address, and let's turn off some of this management features right here. And let's go ahead and review and create this one. It should pass validation, and once I click create, we can watch it start to create the resources, and we'll come back whenever this is finished. And this one should pass validation because it is, again, deploying a B series VM, not a D series VM. So now I have created my VM here. It is my B series VM, so I can go to this resource and see that it is up and running. It did not block me from creating this resource because, again, the SKU is a standard B series VM. So this allows me to create B series VMs, not D series VMs, with this given policy that I have here. So you can see that's one way that I can use policies inside of Azure to enforce specific rules. And we're going to get into some more detailed explanations of how these work and how to create some more manual policies in a future video. So stay tuned for that. But this has just been an intro to Azure Policy, and we'll look at more in-depth studies and how we can use these in detail whenever we go through how to create custom policies and things like that in future videos.
If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintelect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintelect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintelect on Twitter @WintelectNow or @Wintelect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@winelect.com. Until next time, thank you.